You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is John Kempf, the founder of Advancing Eco-Agriculture, AEA, a leading crop nutrition consulting company. A lifelong farmer, John Kempf grew up in and remains a part of the Amish community. I met John at the Heirloom Expo, where I first heard him speak about his systems-based methodology that focuses on plant physiology, mineral nutrition, and soil microbiology. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth discussion with farmer, soil, and plant expert John Kempf. Welcome to Sustainable World Radio, John Kempf.
I'm glad to be here.
If you could start with a bit about your own journey. You grew up on a farm in Ohio, and I believe you said at age 16 you were licensed for pesticide application, and now you're advocating this regenerative, or what you call eco-agriculture. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your journey from point A to point B?
It's proven to be a very interesting journey that has gotten me to this point. I grew up on a small family fresh market fruit and vegetable operation in Northeast Ohio in the snow belt south of Lake Erie. We were growing fresh market vegetables such as tomatoes, cantaloupe, cucumbers, zucchini, and so forth, a variety of different crops. We started growing vegetables in 1994, and we're very mainstream, conventionally oriented from a plant nutrition and agronomy perspective. In addition, my father was the regional distributor for fruit and vegetable inputs, including pesticides. So we were the first people to try all the newest, latest, and greatest cocktails and experiment with them and let our growers and our customers know how well they were working for us. So because of that, we were almost without question the heaviest pesticide user in the region. And then we began having some very interesting experiences. In the early 2000s, we had a 3-year consecutive period from 2002 through 2004. We had 3 consecutive years in which we were losing as much as 65 to 70% of some of our primary crops to diseases and insects. And there were no pesticides and there were no fungicides that would stop them or slow them down. So it became incredibly frustrating. And in that time period, when I graduated from school at the age of 14, I was given the responsibility for doing all of the drip irrigation and foliar applications of nutrients and pesticides. And it was something that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed working closely with plants and watching how plants responded to the materials that we were applying. And as you stated, I became a licensed private pesticide applicator at the age of 16. And so in this 3-year time period, I was investing all of this work and all this energy, and we were getting no results, no response. And the light bulb moment really happened in 2004, the last year of that 3-year period. In 2004, we also began renting some land from a neighboring farm, from a field that came up right against one of our own fields. Because of the field slope, we switched the direction that the field had been tilled in the past and the orientation of the rows that we were planting, so that there were now rows planted across the field border instead of up and down and parallel to the new and the old field border. That year, in that field, we planted a field of cantaloupe right up beside the road where everyone could see them. And I'll remember this field as long as I live. There was, on the old soil, we had a major infestation of downy and powdery mildew, and on the new soil, there was no downy and powdery mildew, not as in 5% or 10%, but 0. And that was the real light bulb moment for me. I wanted to understand, what are the differences between these two plants? They're the same genetics, they were planted the same day, everything supposedly was identical, yet one plant was capable of resisting the downy and the powdery mildew, and the next plant literally 2 feet away was not.
How did you go about finding out what the difference was?
That experience happened in 2004, which was the last of the 3-year period in which we had major crop losses. I was becoming incredibly frustrated with the lack of results we were getting from pesticides. So that winter, I began doing a lot of research. I read a lot of books, did a lot of research, read many different white papers, and I really wanted to know what the differences are from a physiological perspective between these two plants. I talked to a lot of consultants, university professors, people from within academia from all over the world. And what I learned very simply, just at its very simplest, is that we understand that we all have our own immune systems, yet people's immune systems don't all work equally well. All of us have friends who become ill very readily with the first cold or flu bug that comes along. And then we have other friends who practically never become ill. And the only difference between those two is how well their immune system has been supported with nutrition over the course of their entire lifetime. And exactly the same concept holds true for plants. There is a lot of research on inherent plant immune systems and the foundations of plant immune systems, that has research that has been done in the botany and plant physiology areas. And the challenge is that that research has not been transferred to the field. We have not transferred that knowledge into practical application. But the research was out there and the information was there on how to produce really healthy plants, and we simply needed to put those pieces together. So on the farm, I did a lot of experimentation in 2005 with plant nutrition, trying to grow the healthiest, highest quality plants possible. In 2006, we went completely pesticide-free on the farm and have been completely pesticide-free ever since.
And so basically, I think what you're saying, part of this is that plants have immune systems which we as growers can either enhance or diminish.
Absolutely.
So you were experimenting with nutrition for the plants. What type of things were you, feeding them?
So in short, when we look at plant nutrition from a physiological perspective, within mainstream agronomy has focused on balancing plant nutrition with a singular emphasis on yield, trying to balance nutrition to get the highest yields possible, and have not given consideration to improving plant quality and plant health. So we began looking at plant nutrition from a fundamentally different perspective and focusing on improving immunity and improving health instead of focusing exclusively on yield. And what we've learned is that as you improve health and as you improve yield or quality, you can't stop the yields from happening. The yields will go up as a result, and it's actually been a great deal of fun. So what is it that we actually do in the field? In order for plants to have functional immune systems, they need to have completely functioning enzyme systems. So within plants, we have tens of thousands of different enzymes, and all of these enzymes require very specific enzyme cofactors. And these enzyme cofactors are usually trace mineral keys that allow the enzymes to either function or not. So we're talking about trace minerals such as cobalt and molybdenum and selenium and nickel and manganese and zinc and copper and so forth.
It's interesting because people don't really talk about those trace minerals in commercial fertilizer.
Not in commercial fertilizers and not in commercial plant nutrition. In fact, they're just beginning to be addressed and discussed in a much bigger way in human nutrition, where they've been recognized for quite some time, but they're usually still even today not widely considered as the potential root source of disease. What we found in plants very simply was that when we address these trace minerals, in addition to the macronutrients, we have to make sure the plant has a completely balanced diet. And I tell our farmers all the time that there's only one thing that we can't overdo, and that is balance, because any other element can be over-applied. So we really focus on three really big picture fundamental pieces. The first is we focus on addressing mineral balance and making sure we have good levels of plant available nutrients across the entire spectrum. Secondly, we focus on ensuring very vigorous biological digestive systems in the soil. And thirdly, we try to reduce toxins. If there is any toxin accumulation in the soil in the form of past herbicide or pesticide applications or whatever the case may be.
You're working with farmers right now around the world, I believe.
Yes, we work with several thousand farms, mostly here in North America, but kind of all across the country, East Coast, West Coast, many different types of farms. The majority of the farms that we work with are fruit and vegetable operations, where we have really become known for helping farmers grow crops that are resistant to diseases and insects and can greatly reduce, and in some cases even completely eliminate, the need for pesticides, which is a lot of fun. That's what I'm really passionate about.
You said you focus on three things. How do you give these plants a mineral balance? How do you make, mineral balance? How do you make sure they get these minerals?
From our perspective, we use a number of different laboratory analysis as evaluation tools. We use soil analysis and water quality analysis, and most importantly of all, plant analysis. There is a lot of discussion, particularly in the organic/ecological agricultural area, about using soil amendments and rebuilding soil health to grow healthy plants. And the challenge is that what happens in the soil doesn't always translate to what is happening in the plant. So from my perspective, what we really care about is we care about results. We care about growing the healthiest plants possible. The plant is the final report card. So we focus on, we measure plant nutrition. We actually measure the nutrients within the plant sap itself using some new technology from crop health laboratories, in which they're measuring 22 different parameters, all of these trace minerals that I was talking about, the molybdenum and the zinc and copper and manganese and all these various traces, cobalt as well, that they were actually being measured in plant sap, which is very different from the tissue analysis that we have used historically. So that analysis has been very key, and we use that as an indicator to determine whether we are achieving the results that we want to achieve.
Okay, so the plant sap analysis is one way. And then to remineralize, are you using soil amendments, compost tea? How do you help the plants? Say that you receive the plant's report card and they're getting a B minus instead of an A. How do you up that level?
We work with, we will make recommendations for soil amendments, for dry fertilizer applications, for biological inoculants in the form of compost teas, or actual cultured inoculants, which can be very powerful if used correctly and well understood. But I think perhaps most importantly of all, one of the most powerful tools that we have for changing plants and for changing soil is, and this is actually comes as a surprise for some people, but the most powerful tool that we have is foliar applications of nutrients onto plant foliage. And the reason for that is simply because when we all foliar applications, the primary purpose of a foliar application of nutrients onto a plant leaf surface is to increase photosynthesis. If you put on a foliar application and you do not get an acceleration of photosynthesis and increased sugar production, your foliar application has been unsuccessful, from my perspective. There is a secondary purpose, and it's very secondary, in addressing trace mineral deficiencies. So if we have deficiencies, we can then address those deficiencies and have that plant's nutritional profile and nutritional integrity be improved very quickly. But ultimately what happens is when you improve photosynthesis, that plant's energy goes up and you get better soil microbiology, you improve soil health, and there's an entire cascade of effects that happens when you put a foliar application on plants. So in reality, you're putting on a very small quantity of material, and through the exponential mechanism of working with plants, you get a much bigger response relative to the product that you actually applied.
Interesting. And I believe that you spoke about that, and that was very fascinating to me, about what happens when plants do have an increased capacity for photosynthesis. I think you were saying it's more chlorophyll, more sugars produced, more energy, and more production of lipids. Could you tell our listeners a bit about that?
There's this entire cascade that happens within the plant, and then also how that plant influences the environment around it. But to focus on the internal mechanisms, throughout the photosynthetic process, you cannot speed up the biochemical reactions that are photosynthesis. There is a finite speed at which they can move. However, what you can do, there's a number of things that you can do if you have thicker leaves, if you have wider leaves, if you have a greater density of chlorophyll per the leaf area. All of those things are going to contribute to improved sugar production. So if we measure the sugar in the plant sap, I'm not referring to a Brix reading, but to an actual measured sugar reading. If you measure which is one of the things that we do with the sap analysis, if you measure the sugar content, we consistently find that many plants are producing, on average, somewhere between 15 and 20% of the total sugar content that they have the inherent potential to produce in any given 24-hour period, the photosynthetic period. The result of the cause of having that lowered photosynthetic activity is all based in not having the right ratios or the right concentrations of nutrients and enzyme cofactors in the right place at the right time. So if we balance nutrition, photosynthesis has the capacity to increase by a factor of 4 to 5 times or even more very consistently. So what we expect to see happening is when we put on a foliar application that has been properly designed, we expect to see a strong spike in photosynthetic activity and total sugar production. So that leads to a plant that now has a lot more sugars and a lot more energy than it has had in the past. When a plant begins accumulating a surplus of energy, more energy than it needs, it will store that energy in the form of fats in exactly the same way that an animal does. And when that happens, now the lipid concentration, the concentration of omega-3 and omega-6 essential fatty acids in that plant is going to increase. And that plant now becomes resistant to a whole new set of diseases, potential disease pathogens, and it also has an energy backup. Fats within the plant are essentially an energy storage tissue or energy storage, exactly the same way as fat is in animals. So if you encounter stress conditions, drought, low water, running out of water, or extreme weather conditions, if plants have a higher fat content, they have a backup battery that they can continue to function even without ideal conditions. So it's a tremendous buffer against environmental stress.
Wow, which is very helpful in times of drought like we're having in the West.
We're finding very clearly that whenever we improve the lipid concentrations in plants, they become much more drought resistant. And there seem to be several mechanisms. One of them, interestingly enough, seems to be that they have a greatly reduced water requirement because of the higher oil content on the leaf surface and much stronger, waxier leaf cuticles. They seem to not transpire or evaporate nearly as much water. So the water requirements actually seem to go down.
John, tell our listeners a bit about so these plants have increased health, they have more increased resilience. How does that affect the environment around them in the soil and etc.?
There has been a common understanding that it takes healthy soil to grow healthy plants. However, today we have, over the last 7 decades or longer, we have adopted a model of agriculture that degenerates our soil health, that constantly degenerates plant health. And so I personally have been very passionate about trying to learn and understand how we can develop regenerative agricultural models that regenerate soil health and regenerate plant health. So I was trying to understand how we can rapidly build organic matter in soils, how we can rapidly build biological communities. And I became very intrigued when I came to realize that the fastest way and the most successful way of rebuilding soil health is not by applying compost, it's not by applying biologicals, it's not by applying manure or compost tea or whatever the case might be. And surprisingly enough, it's not even by growing cover crops. But the fastest way to regenerate soil and to build soil health is in fact to grow healthy crops because of how truly healthy plants influence the environment around them. So there's this entire cascade that happens, and to get into the science behind this cascade, there's a lot of science behind it, but just kind of the overview, there are 6 distinct steps. The first step is photosynthesis. Extraordinarily healthy plants that are producing levels of sugars 4 to 5 times higher than what is average. Not what is normal, but what is average today, because many of the plants that we are growing today are not what I would call normal. They're extremely unhealthy. So if we grow plants that have a much higher sugar content, then a significant amount of that total sugar production is transferred out through the root systems as root exudates. So if you look at a plant's total sugar production over the course of its entire lifetime, you have a total sugar production of 100%. That total of 100% is divided into 4 roughly equal pieces, in which you have 25% is used to build the plant frame, 25% is used to build fruit or to fill fruit. So there you have 50% above ground. The remaining 50% is below ground. 25% gets used to build root biomass, and 25% gets sent out through the roots as root exudates to feed soil biology. That, of course, doesn't all happen equally throughout the plant's entire lifetime. There are different sugar sinks at different stages of growth. But the interesting piece here is that when plants are producing a lot of sugars, then obviously that 50% below ground represents a much greater amount. However, if we have unhealthy plants, the state in which most plants and most crops are today, they're not going to have enough sugar to send it out through the roots as root exudates. So you don't get that sugar accumulation. So what happens here is, if you think about this for a moment, let's say we're growing a crop that has 5,000 pounds of plant biomass above the soil. That means we also have 5,000 pounds of biomass below the soil. And that means that we send out 2,500 pounds of sugars as root exudates. We cannot put on enough molasses and enough liquid fish to compete with that. We simply cannot apply enough product to produce the same results that plants can produce if they are really healthy. The interesting part, of course, is that when we send out sugars through the roots as root exudates, sugars are simply carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. They contain no minerals. Those sugars are digested by bacteria, and primarily, as well as other organisms, but primarily by bacteria. And the bacterial digestive process is termed mineralization. So this is actually the second step of the process. The first step is photosynthesis. The second step is root exudates as sugars and bacterial digestion. So the bacterial digestion process is called mineralization. And in the mineralization process, they are feeding on these sugars. The bacterial population is expanding, and since sugars contain no minerals, and they need minerals to form their own cells, they will extract minerals from the soil mineral matrix and incorporate them into their own bodies. Then, as this bacterial population cycles, is grazed upon by nematodes, protozoa, fungi, the nutrients contained within their bodies are metabolized and are now made available for plants to absorb. So plants can now actually get calcium and potassium and magnesium and trace elements and other elements from the soil profile that were not available to them earlier because of this bacterial digestion process. So that's the second step. The third step is when plants begin absorbing these microbial metabolites, amino acids, organic acids, and essential fatty acids combined with minerals. When this happens, plants now become much more energy efficient. And this is the stage at which they start truly developing a surplus of energy. They have more energy than they know what to do with. And at that point, they now begin storing that surplus energy in the form of lipids, which leads us to the next step. We now have lipids being sent out, fats and oils being sent out through the roots as root exudates in addition to the sugars. Now the interesting piece is that bacteria cannot digest oil. Only fungi can digest oil. So now, instead of bacterial digestion, we get fungal digestion. And this is a point that is worthy of pointing out, is that there is a significant imbalance between bacterial biomass and fungal biomass in many of our agricultural soils. And many microbiologists will focus on the need to build soil fungi and putting out food sources to build soil fungi. At the end of the day, if we want to build strong fungi, the first step in the process is to build really strong bacterial communities, because strong bacterial communities lead to strong fungal communities through this mechanism. When we get fungal digestion of lipids, this leads to the final step. The fungal digestive process is very different in that it is termed the humification process. So fungi simply digest and process organic residues and lipids over and over again until they reach a point at which they can be digested no further. And at this point, they are now referred to as stable humic substances. And this is really how you build soil organic matter. So, for example, what I'm describing very simply means that how much organic matter you build in soil has absolutely nothing to do with how much compost you apply or how large a cover crop biomass you grow. You can have 2 fields with cover crops, both have 10,000 pounds of plant biomass per acre. One field is 2% fat content, the second field is an 8% fat content, and the field that has an 8% fat content will produce 4 times more stable organic matter in that soil than the field that has 2%.
Are you saying, and this is just kind of simplifying it, if plants aren't healthy enough to produce lipids, then the fungi is not going to be so prevalent in the soil? Is that correct?
That is exactly what I'm saying, yes.
So really focus on plant health, and then, as you're saying, the cascade will eventually affect the soil health as well.
The fastest way to regenerate soil is to grow really healthy plants, and it happens much, much faster and much quicker than we would like to give it credit for. It is possible for us to regenerate soil health and develop a loose, crumbly soil texture from very active fungal populations in a single growing season or even less. It can sometimes, I've seen it happen in as little as 6 weeks.
Wow. This is very hopeful.
It's, if you think about it from an agroecology perspective, and think about the development of the many feet of topsoil that we have on the Great Plains in the American Midwest, that topsoil was developed by plants, grasses, which are very efficient photosynthesizers, the C4 photosynthetic pathway. We talk about the bison and grazing and all of those pieces, and they're very important. I'm not discounting them or discrediting them in any way. But the reality is that the greatest amount of organic matter was built deep underground around these root systems because these plants were very healthy in producing high oil content. So there's one piece that I missed mentioning, referred to it by default, but to form stable humic substances, organic matter, if we add compost to our soils, for example, or if we incorporate a cover crop, that organic residue is going to continue to be constantly degraded and digested. It'll go through different digestive processes until it reaches the point at which it can be digested no more. And that point, that final digestive point, is determined by the lipid concentration. So it ultimately, the formation of organic matter is based on the lipid concentration in a plant and in a crop. And that's really how it is possible for us to grow healthy plants and regenerate soil health. And that is why I believe that foliar applications are so critically important, because it is possible for us to spike a plant's photosynthetic rate from a baseline of 2 up to a 10 in a matter of 24 hours.
How does the foliar spray affect the leaves, I guess, the plant leaf ability to photosynthesize?
The entire photosynthetic process is structured around enzyme cofactors, around chlorophyll, and really minerals are required as catalysts to catalyze the process at every single step of the way. So as soon as you have one element that is in short supply, it slows down the entire assembly line, so to speak. So let's just say, for example, a very common example is plants that are low in magnesium. So magnesium is the center ion of the chlorophyll molecule, and if a plant is low in magnesium, it will have a much lower chlorophyll concentration. So simply increasing the magnesium content can bring up the chlorophyll concentration, and thus you get a lot more sugar production. Another common deficiency could be manganese deficiency, where manganese is required as an energy transfer mechanism in the photosynthetic process. If manganese is deficient, it will slow down the entire chain. So if we simply focus on making sure that we have the ideal nutrient balance to function, which of all the nutrients that function in the photosynthetic process, we can speed up the entire, or I shouldn't say speed up, what I originally say is remove the blockages. We can remove all the blockages that are slowing down photosynthesis and allow photosynthesis to proceed at the speed at which it would like to proceed.
So you're creating the conditions for optimal photosynthesis.
Absolutely.
Say that I was a farmer and my crops were doing poorly, and you came and did plant sap analysis, found out that my crops were deficient in magnesium, say. You would put a foliar spray on my crops and then would test later, do another analysis to test and see how it had improved.
Yes, we take a very systematic approach to plant nutrition. There are no magic bullets. There is no quick fix. We expect to get very rapid plant responses if we do it correctly, but ultimately, if we are talking about growing plants with functional immune systems that have a large degree of resistance, that is a process that is going to take some time. So we will use a very systematic approach and do a very thorough audit of the soil profile. We'll do soil analysis on different soil types across the farm. We will look, if you're using irrigation, we'll look at irrigation water quality, and then we'll do a plant sap analysis as well. And based on all that information, we will put together a complete system of plant nutrition that will include soil amendments, biological inoculants, and foliar applications and nutrient supplements to be applied through the irrigation system. We'll look at it from a very systematic perspective over the course of the entire year. And then during the growing season, we take plant sap analysis every 2 weeks as a management tool. And the sap analysis are very powerful because they can detect nutrient imbalances as much as 4 to 6 weeks earlier than the typical tissue analysis can, which gives us plenty of time to do something about them and to reverse the problems before they ever show up. So we then will adjust the nutrients that we're applying throughout the entire growing season. And then based on what we've learned on that farm, working with them this year, and how their soil has responded, how plants have responded, we will then slightly adjust and shift our recommendations for the following year. And over the course of, depending on how rapidly the crops that we're working with and how rapidly the farm is responding, over the course of several cropping cycles, we can quickly evolve to the point where we can effectively prevent most of the problems from ever showing up.
And have you had good results with the farmers you're working with?
We have had outstanding results. We're getting to be very well known for helping farmers achieve very high levels of disease and insect resistance on many different crops, ranging from strawberries and blueberries and cherries to tomatoes and apples and asparagus and everything in between.
John, you mentioned earlier that you focus on 3 areas, and one of them was reduce toxins. So I assume when you're talking about this foliar spray, you are not spraying Miracle-Gro or Roundup on the plants. Can you talk a bit about that?
It's actually a very interesting point. In order to develop regenerative systems, one of the first rules is, first of all, do no harm. And we have learned that in order to really accelerate soil regeneration and plant regeneration to the greatest degree possible, we have to discontinue the use of materials that are, in effect, shooting ourselves in the foot. So in mainstream agriculture, a number of the products that are widely used, the plant nutrition products that are widely used as nutrient inputs, produce a very nice plant response. We get a very strong plant growth response, but they strongly suppress soil biology and they strongly suppress soil health. And we have learned that if we want to develop truly regenerative systems, we need to focus on using inputs that enhance both sides of the cycle. They need to improve plant growth and vigor, and they need to improve soil health at the same time. They cannot enhance one at the expense of the other. We will not use materials that can have a negative impact on one side or the other. And specifically, I'd like to discuss fungicides and insecticides that are sprayed onto plants. There's this plants, as they are growing, metabolizing compounds, one of the groups of 4 compounds that they are producing are proteins. And insects and diseases are often very dependent on specific amino acids or specific nitrogen compounds as an energy source or as a nutrient source. So plants that are really healthy, that are growing really well, have all the air, water, sunshine, and minerals that they need, are forming complete proteins and are termed as being in protein synthesis mode, growth mode. Plants that are unhealthy, that are lacking some of the critical elements that they need, are termed as being in protein breakdown mode or proteolysis. And plants that are in protein breakdown mode are very susceptible to diseases. They're very susceptible to insects because they are now producing the food source, the soluble amino acids, the soluble nitrogen compounds that these insects and diseases are dependent on for a food source. So the very interesting piece is that Plants can switch back and forth between these two states fairly readily. And when they convert from protein synthesis to proteolysis mode or protein breakdown mode, not only do they lack the capacity to form complete proteins, but they can actually break down proteins that they have made in the past. So something that has been well documented and understood for the last 60 plus years, a lot of the original research was done back in the 1940s and 50s, was that many pesticides, most pesticides, and I say pesticides as specifically fungicides have the most aggressive negative response, and insecticides are a close second. They will almost immediately, within a matter of hours, switch a plant from protein synthesis to proteolysis mode, from protein synthesis to protein breakdown. So what that is saying really is that these pesticide applications are making plants unhealthier, and they're predisposing them to disease attack and insect attack. And what we are finding, we have found this very true to be very true in practice in the field. The more toxins that farmers use and spray onto the crop, the more dependent they are on them and the more problems they have. So I'm not advocating that farmers immediately discontinue the use of all pesticides. That doesn't make sense from a production agriculture perspective. However, I would suggest that if it makes sense, depending on the pest that we're dealing with, that we not prophylactically apply pesticides to try to prevent the problem, because based on this information, they are not a problem prevention. They will often lead to the problem that we're trying to prevent. We have to earn the right to discontinue the use of pesticides.
How does a healthy plant ward off pests?
So as plant health improves, and we have, in working with many different farms, many different types of crops, many different soil types, we have noticed and observed a gradual evolution of plant health, where plants become resistant to different groups of pests at different stages of development, or different stages of health evolution, if you will. So we observed 4 different stages, and each of these stages is directly linked to what is happening within that plant's metabolism. So the first stage is when photosynthesis accelerates, and we get the formation of complete carbohydrates and very low levels of soluble sugars and soluble carbohydrates in the plant sap. At that stage, the plants become largely resistant to the soil-borne fungal pathogens. The second stage is when they achieve true protein synthesis and they have very low levels of nitrates and ammonia and soluble amino acids in the plant sap. And at this stage, they become resistant to many insects that have simpler digestive systems, such as the larval insects, tomato hornworm, European corn borer, and so forth. The third stage is, and these first 2 stages are purely a function of nutritional balance and nutritional integrity. We can accomplish them in a hydroponic situation. They're not dependent on biology. The third stage is a little bit different, and that is when plants develop a surplus of energy and begin forming higher levels of oils. And at this stage, they will develop this glossy, waxy sheen on the leaf surface, and they now become much more resistant to the airborne fungal pathogens such as downy and powdery mildew, bacterial speck, bacterial spot, and so forth. Then lastly, the most important, and the one that we really care about, well, we care about all of them for that matter, but at the 4th stage, they now begin producing plant protectants in much larger quantities. So these are compounds that are referred to as plant secondary metabolites, and these are compounds that plants produce as plant protectants to protect themselves from ultraviolet radiation, from insect attack, disease attack, overgrazing, whatever the case may be. Examples would be compounds such as anthocyanins, resveratrol, terpenoids, sesquiterpenes, bioflavonoids.
Like essential oils, almost, the components in essential oils?
Yes, in plain English, we call them essential oils.
That is, as an aromatherapist, I can relate to this. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
If we want to talk about growing plants that have fully functional immune systems and really talk about growing food as medicine, this is where the medicine is. Because ultimately what happens is all plants produce these compounds. The levels of these compounds within plants is not static. It will change drastically based on that plant's health. For example, there was some research done in the early 1990s at Michigan State University and on blueberries, and they discovered that the anthocyanin content in blueberries can vary by a factor of as much as 25 times based on genetics and environment. That's a huge variable. So if we produce food that has high levels of these plant secondary metabolites and plants that have a functional immune system, they now have the capacity to transfer that immunity to the people who eat that food. And that is how you truly produce food as medicine.
So when we're applying toxic chemicals to our food, we're kind of arresting the development of these oils.
Yes, we're arresting and effectively preventing the development of those oils.
And hence that would affect our health as well from when we ingest these plants.
I believe that as farmers and food producers, we have a tremendous responsibility since we are responsible for producing the food that people eat. We are the ultimate healthcare system. What we have today is not healthcare. We have a disease care system. And agriculture is really the foundation of healthcare. So in producing the food that people eat, we can do more to keep people healthy than all the doctors and hospitals combined. We can prevent people from becoming ill. And we can prevent people from becoming ill in two ways. The first rule of medicine is, first of all, do no harm. And there is plenty of documented evidence that many of the toxins that we apply in and on our food supply do in fact contribute some level of harm to the human organism. Secondly, when we grow plants that have a functional immune system, they're resistant to diseases and insects. They will then transfer that immunity through these plant secondary metabolites to the people who eat that food, and we can grow food as medicine. So if it is true that we can do more to keep people healthy than doctors, we are really preventative medicine. And that also means that the reverse of that must also be true. We can have that same kind of very strong negative impact on people's health by producing food that is unhealthy and that is laced with toxins.
That's very empowering for farmers listening to this right now. That's a lot of power and a lot of influence that they can have. So if someone is listening who is a conventional farmer and growing crops and they would like to begin the transition to more ecological agriculture, what is one of the first steps that they could do besides contacting you? And we'll give your contact information as well. But what's something they could do?
I would suggest consistently in working with many different farms where we see the largest return for the smallest amount of investment is using foliar applications of plant nutrition. They have to be properly designed. And the design simply needs to be the first priority needs to be to increase photosynthesis. The second priority is address nutritional imbalances, always in that order. And if we followed those steps, we consistently see a very strong crop response. So that's a very simple step that almost all farmers can do to get a very strong crop response in the field.
And what is your contact information for people who want to learn more about your work?
There is a lot of information available online at our website, advancingecoag.com. I have a blog that I would welcome people to subscribe to, in which I share insights and new things that we have learned and are learning about soil plant systems and how they function, and how to also make that information practical and how we can apply it in our fields. So our website is advancingecoag.com, and we share a lot of information there. And in addition to that, we are also have just purchased a farm and are in the process of establishing our first farm as a research and demonstration farm to really demonstrate what the possibilities are with some of the crops that we're working with, and to make that information public. And so that farm will be we're calling a production permaculture farm with a multitude of different fruit and vegetable crops that will primarily be marketed through a direct-to-consumer CSA here in Northeast Ohio.
That's great. And will you have interns there? People can go and learn?
Yes, there will be intern opportunities and opportunities for people to work on that farm. It'll be a great place to work.
Anything else that you would like to add that I didn't ask you today about this fascinating world of ecological agriculture?
I would just add that now is a time of tremendous opportunity in agriculture. We have access to information and we have the information, we have the knowledge on how to develop truly regenerative models of agriculture. We know how to grow healthy plants that are resistant to diseases and insects. We know how to regenerate soil health. And there is a tremendous opportunity for those who are willing to grasp that opportunity and move forward.
We've spoken a lot about plants and your work with plants. What do you like most about your work that you're doing right now?
All of it. I can't think of one single thing that stands out more than any other thing. But what I'm really passionate about is two pieces that fit very closely together. Growing healthier, higher quality food for people and regenerating agriculture and the health of the planet. If we could, I have a very clear vision that I can envision very clearly of what the earth could be. We are tapping such a small amount of the inherent potential that our plants have and such a very small amount of the inherent potential of our agricultural resources. We can do much better than what we are doing today, and we can regenerate agriculture and regenerate ecology and regenerate our food at the same time if we simply implement the principles that we have already learned systematically rather than piecemeal.
Thank you so much, John, for your interview and your knowledge. And if you'd like to learn more about John Kempf's work, visit his website, advancingecoag.com. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.